Hi everyone, my name is Sarah. I want to start today by acknowledging country. I'm coming in today from my house on beautiful Wurundjeri country, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands on which you're coming in from today, and the First Nations people of the land that you're coming in from today, Peter, as well. We pay respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge that here this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Welcome everyone to the first of our Jewish Council conversations with our very esteemed guest, Peter Beinart. We're really excited to have so many of you online this morning. I'll give a little bit of a brief introduction to us, the Jewish Council, and a little bit of housekeeping, and then we will start our conversation this morning. So the Jewish Council is a group of volunteers. We're made up of writers, academics, lawyers, and teachers. We've got a focus on anti-racism and anti-Semitism and human rights. We launched in February this year in response to Israel's horrific campaign of violence in Gaza, which is now reaching its 1-year anniversary, and the way in which many Jewish organisations in Australia are continuing to beat the drums of war on behalf of all Jewish people, and then using this false premise of Jewish unity to silence voices in support of Palestinian human rights. We've been largely focusing on anti-racism work and advocating for the Australian government to take material action to prevent Israel's human rights abuses. But since launching, we've also been really blown away by the support that we've received. We've had over 820 Jewish people in Australia and counting who've signed on to our statement of core principles available on our website. And many of you have also been contacting us saying that you want us to create more spaces for gathering, critical discussion and community building between Jews who no longer feel represented by our mainstream organisations. This event is hopefully the start of many. It's our attempt to do this, and we really hope to be able to continue to grow and create more spaces for diverse visions of Jewishness. Today, Dr. Max Kaiser, who with me is a co-executive officer of the Jewish Council, will be in conversation with our very esteemed guest, Peter Beinart. Just a bit of housekeeping. We have collected questions from you for this conversation beforehand. We were really overwhelmed with all the questions that people asked, and that shows a real appetite for critical discussions. But due to time limitations, we'll only be able to ask some of them in this conversation, and we'll have to save the others for next time. You're very welcome to post questions in the chat while we're speaking, and Max and I will try to get through what we can. Today's event was free, thanks to our generous supporters who enabled it by donating to our Ko-fi account. We've also been raising funds for this event for the Palestine Australia Relief and Action, PARA, which is an incredible Palestinian-led organisation to help Palestinian migrants and refugees coming to Australia. If you haven't, I'd really urge everyone to give what they can to PARA. And so without further ado, it's my great privilege to introduce our guest, Peter Beinart, whose thoughtful and compassionate writing and work has been a real inspiration to me personally, and I know to others in the council. Peter is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, an MSNBC political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He writes the Peter Beinart Notebook newsletter. He's the author of The Crisis of Zionism, and his forthcoming book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, will be published in January 2025 and is available for pre-order on Amazon. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. I'll turn over to Max to get us started with the conversation.
Thanks very much, Peter, for being with us today. First question is really about I guess your career and views are shifting over time. So for people who haven't followed your career, can you tell us a bit about how your ideas have shifted over time? Your views about Israel have significantly changed from defending Israel in 2020. From defending Israel to in 2020, saying that you no longer believe in the Jewish state and endorsing the Palestinian demand for a single binational state. which sees equality for Palestinians and Israelis. And then in 2021, making the Jewish case for a Palestinian right of return. Can you take us through the process of how you came to change your views?
Sure. And I also just wanted to say how what a pleasure it is to be speaking to people in Australia. I have like many Australian Jews, my parents emigrated from South Africa, and indeed, before my father ended up at MIT, he had a job offer in Australia, and my parents could have, and my mother many times throughout our life, every time something went wrong in the United States or America did something crazy politically, she would often say to me, we could have been in Australia. So and when I actually went to Australia for the first time and really had the real tremendous privilege of being with Mark Baker, who was someone who really had a very big impact on me, and Louise Adler and others, I just realized what an extraordinary place it was, and how beautiful the Jewish community was. And I recognized that politically, it's probably not a Jewish community where I would be in the mainstream. Maybe I'd be even more off the derech in Melbourne or Sydney than I am in New York. And still, I just the sense of community and the depth of the institutions and the was something that I was very, very powerful to witness. And I think American Jews could learn a lot from the richness of Jewish life in Australia. In terms of my own opinions, I grew up in a family where the importance of Israel as a Jewish state was simply unquestioned. It was, my grandmother in particular, who immigrated to South Africa from Egypt, where she was born, I remember would very frequently tell me whenever I would boast about the United States, she would say, "You really shouldn't get too comfortable anywhere." Jewish life in diaspora is always going to be precarious, and her life had been precarious. And and even though she didn't live in Israel, her brother did, and this sense of psychic security that she had, that there was a Jewish state, I think had an impact on me from early on. And I also, that my grandfather, my father, I just saw how delighted they were to be in Israel, that the sense of being part of a Jewish civilization, seeing it and the street signs, walking through Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, it's something I didn't fully appreciate until I myself became an adult, was something that was just very much part of my life growing up. I'm sure it's similar for many others. I did recognize, as I came of age during the first Intifada, when I was in high school, I did have a dawning realization that perhaps there was a problem with Israel controlling all of these millions of people who lacked citizenship. And so as people started to talk about a two-state solution in the late 80s and early 90s, that seemed to me to be the right answer. And it seemed to me to offer a way of kind of dealing with a tension that I think is deep within Judaism itself, between a kind of universal moral obligation and a kind of particular obligation that we have to one another as Jews, given that often Judaism or Jewishness is imagined as a kind of extended family, the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, that we imagine ourselves as a kind of extended family. We have special obligations to one another. And so I argued this point for many, many decades, along with many other people. And I began to, and I would say, like many people, that the two-state solution was slipping away, that it seemed to become less and less likely as Israel continued to build more and more settlements in the West Bank, in the place where the Palestinians were going to build a state. And I could feel over the years that saying this again and again and again, it began to me to feel like what I was saying was less compelling. Even as I was saying it, if you speak publicly, I don't know if others have this experience or right. I feel like I can often tell when there's a false note in what I'm saying. And Palestinian friends and colleagues said to me over the years, he said, "Peter, the two-state solution cannot be perpetually dying. At some point, you have to recognize that it's dead, right? You have to be open to thinking about other alternatives." But I really had not invested, to be honest, any time in thinking about alternatives. And the prospect of thinking about alternatives was actually very frightening to me, because it required me to rethink just very, very fundamental axioms. And I was also, frankly, terrified about what the consequences in my own life would be, because I knew I was already skating on a pretty thin edge in terms of being welcome in Jewish spaces, Jewish communities, shuls, Jewish day schools, that were very, very important to me and my family. And I just didn't want to, punch people, I just didn't know how many times I could keep rhetorically punching people in the mouth, how far out off the derech I could get before basically nobody ever invited me for Shabbat lunch again. So, but I was during COVID, I ended up having a lot of time on my own. And I thought, let me just spend some time trying to read deeply into the literature about people who have thought about one equal state, and about binational states more generally. And as I began to do that reading, I was struck by two things. The first was the sense among political scientists that societies, even very divided societies, tend to be more peaceful when everyone has a voice in government than when one group is locked out of government. And it is kind of intuitive, right? That if you are locked out of government, you have very little way of getting the government to pay any attention to you other than forms of violence. Whereas if you have the vote, even in a very imperfect system, you have some possibility of getting your needs met. And the second was that I was very struck at an emotional level by how much of the Palestinian, because a lot of this was Palestinian writing about one equal country, had a generosity of spirit to it that was so contrary to the way I had always been raised, which was to imagine that essentially Palestinians were just looking for the first opportunity they could to put Jews on boats back to Poland. I was very struck by Edward Said's writing near the end of his life, because Said had been a supporter of the two-state solution, but soured on it and ultimately came to endorse the idea of a binational state, in a way resurrecting the idea of Jewish thinkers, kind of like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus in the 30s and 40s, who had been arguing this. I perhaps also my South African background, I kind of began to almost relive the many conversations that I heard in my own family during the 1980s, when everyone was absolutely convinced that one person, one vote in a country that's, let's remember, unlike Israel-Palestine, which is roughly 50-50 Palestinian and Jewish, South Africa is, whites are only 10% of the population. And it was considered so obvious in my family and most other white South Africans I knew that whites would be in mortal peril, that it wasn't even worth arguing about. It was considered so obvious, right? And yet in retrospect, it seems one can see that actually white South Africans are so much better off than they would have been if apartheid had lasted for another several generations. It was unimaginable for most white South Africans that the ANC's military wing, Mkhonto weSizwe, which the US classified as a terrorist group, would put down its weapons. But in retrospect, it was quite logical that once Black South Africans had the vote, that there would be less of a need, less of a market, you could say, for armed resistance. So anyway, all of this led me to think that there were options, that it was possible to think outside this paradigm, and I even came to believe that not only was this possible, but that it would be more just, because the way a two-state solution is generally imagined in Jewish discourse is that the purpose of it is to maintain a very large Jewish majority, even within a smaller border, and that precludes the possibility of Palestinians being able to return to the places they're from. And I remember I was actually in the midst of this, thinking about all this back in 2020 during Tisha B'Av, and I was listening to these keynote about kind of the imagining the destructions of the temple and this longing to return. I just thought there is really something absurd about us, of all people, telling Palestinians that after 75 years they should forget the places they're from and give up on the desire to go back to them. We are really the last people in the world who should be saying that to another group of people. And so I began to read about return as well, and began to see it outside of this prism, which is so dominant in our community, that this means that Jews are kicked out of their homes and dispossessed, that actually a lot of people have thought about ways of doing that don't involve that whatsoever. And finally, and then I'll stop, is that I don't think Jewish statehood, or a state that explicitly privileges Jews over Palestinians, could ever allow Palestinians legal equality. And in a world where there is a global struggle about ethno-nationalism, indeed very, very much in my own country, in the United States, where we're struggling against very powerful forces that essentially want to say that America should be a white Christian country, it seems to be fundamentally incoherent to basically have that fight in the United States and oppose this kind of ethno-nationalism in Hungary and in France and in Germany and Brazil and everywhere else, right? But make an exception for Israel, because it turns out once you make an exception for your group, or India, a whole lot of other people are also interested in making that exception, and it undermines the coherence of that principle, right? If you don't believe in that principle for yourself, do you really believe it at all? So anyway, these were some of the thoughts that led me ultimately to come to the position that I hold now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it seems to me that, these sort of contradictions that you've been clearly thinking about deeply for a long time and have very, I guess, generously, or, had to challenge a lot of those fundamental or core beliefs. That's been a transformation that has not just been your transformation, but it really seems to us in Australia like there is a broader shift amongst Jewish people, both in America, but also around the world, who are shifting their views on Israel away from sort of what you mentioned. And a lot of us here, I think, on this call could share the same sentiment that, the way that we were taught about Israel as young people, not everyone, was just sort of this unquestioning support, and not really learning about its history and Palestinian, demands and rights. And I wanted to ask you sort of that broader question of, from afar, it seems like when we look at statistics, all these stats about, 40% of younger Jews in America think that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. And then I think there was a recent survey that 2/3 of Jewish people in America were uncomfortable with the actions of Israel. And it seems like there has been this clear shift, and the sort of American Jewish consensus around Israel is collapsing. And I think while we have some of that, we certainly see a lot of that shift in Australia, and we've been really blown away from launching as an organization with just how many Jewish people have reached out to us. We don't have those same, I don't know if we have those same numbers. And we do have an extreme, we've got our Jewish institutions seem to be moving in the exact opposite direction, where a lot of the mainstream organizations in Australia are, celebrating Israel's aggression, celebrating Israel's, recent attacks in Lebanon. They're partnering with fundamentalist Christian Zionists, and even our, supposedly progressive Jewish media in Australia also seems to be taking that turn, to the right. And I'm really interested, and I think we're all really interested, if for you to speak a little bit about what the conditions you think were that led to this, that led to the cultural and political landscape of Jewishness and Zionism in the US, and led to that, break in that uniformity around Israel.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think American Jewry is, I think, is less similar to other smaller Jewish diaspora communities than often those communities are to one another. So I think Canada, Australia, South Africa, even Britain, I think, have more in common with one another than America does with them. And maybe even you could say that the continental European countries also. Partly, I think that because the American Jewish community is comparatively so large, and is so comparatively assimilated, because America has just a very ravenously assimilated culture, and American Jews have also comparatively been in the United States a bit longer than I think Australian. I think, if I'm correct, I think a higher percentage of Australian Jews came either before or after World War II, whereas American Jews are more likely to have come in the late 19th or early 20th century. There's been a longer period of this kind of assimilation, and that I think that what part of the result of that kind of the level of assimilation and the fact that it's a relatively large Jewish community is that there isn't really such a thing in the United States as a Jewish community. There's not really the same kind of center that I think exists in certain small, which means that the price of excommunication is not quite as high. Right? There's so many American Jews are just completely unaffiliated from any Jewish institutions, just doing their own thing. And there's not a tradition of kind of organized communal top-down leadership that you find in some other countries. And I think it means that there's not quite as high a social price to pay. I think that's I think that's one reason. Again, also, most American Jews, we don't have a hegemonic Orthodox. Many other communities, you at least have a kind of hegemonic Orthodoxy, even if you're not Orthodox in practice. That's the kind of the name that you adopt for the shul you don't go to. America has not been like that for many, many decades now. I think that's part of it. I think American Jews also, non-Orthodox American Jews, have very deeply bought in, many of them, to a story about Jewishness. It is very shaped by the American experience, by the American Jewish role in the civil rights movement, in the labor movement, in the women's movement, in the LGBT. Now, again, there are echoes of that, I know, in other Jewish communities as well, but I think that that creates a kind of universalism, again, particularly when it's twinned with declining religious observance, because truthfully, Orthodox Jews in the United States do remain very, very, very strongly pro-Israel and generally supporting the Republican Party. But I think those things that mean that American Jews, I think those American Jews who are more secular and more assimilated and who have this notion of being Jewish as having some connection to kind of being on the side of the underdog, that once Palestinians enter into the conversation, and I think that's what's changed in the last generation, generation of it, that especially on social media, Palestinians are more present. And when American college students Jewish students go to college now, they're more likely to meet Palestinian students. And although the media would suggest that those interactions are purely hostile and terrifying, in my experience, actually often they're experiences of learning, And so, and especially when when you have Palestinian American students and American Jewish students, and the Palestinian students say to the American Jewish students, look, what we both want in America is a country of equality under the law where no one is privileged and the government has no religious or racial identity. Why don't you want that in Israel and Palestine too? I think that's an argument that many younger American Jews find compelling. Now, again, I don't want to suggest that that's hegemonic. I really think that what's happened is, instead of a Zionist consensus in America, what we have is a kind of a very fierce internal civil war, often within families, along generational lines. But there are also a significant number of younger American Jews who remain very, very staunchly Zionist. Again, coming out of the Orthodox community, sometimes people from more immigrant Jewish communities. For instance, I think it's not coincidental that some of the most high-profile kind of Zionist activist kids on American college campuses are the children of Persian Jewish immigrants, which is a community that also tends to be very, very strongly pro-Israel. So I think what there is a much deeper divide, but also the power dynamic in the Jewish community is still very lopsided, right? So in terms of, because American Jews who strongly support Israel are older and more affiliated and wealthier, they tend to have much more political influence than the American Jews who question that. But what has happened is that American Jews who are critical of the war and even skeptical of the idea of Jewish supremacy, to use a controversial but I think term that I would be willing to defend. I think what's happened is that though that wing of the Jewish community is becoming integrated into a multi-religious, multiracial movement that includes a lot of Palestinians, that includes a lot of Black Americans, that includes, frankly, the same kind of Americans who were involved in protesting the Vietnam War, who were involved in protesting the apartheid in South Africa. And that movement, especially since October 7th, has really shown remarkable strength on the ground. It hasn't really translated into the political process very much, because we have a very corrupt political process in which it's often hard to get public opinion expressed, even inside the Democratic Party. But there's a movement which has emerged that I think will show its power over time.
Thanks, Peter. I want now to turn, I guess, to your analysis of more current events, and particularly Israel's escalating aggression in Lebanon. Obviously, there's been some pretty major developments over the last day or so there. And I guess particularly we want to talk about the US's role in all of this. Watching afar from Australia, I think, we've all sort of been asking the question, when is the US going to intervene to stop all this? Do they have an interest in stopping all this? Or is sort of US and Israel's strategic interests one and the same? So love to just get your take on that. What is the US's role in all of this? And what are we seeing now in terms of escalation and turn to a regional war?
I mean, I think that the Biden administration's unwillingness to use America's leverage. America has a great deal of leverage. Israel is very dependent on American weapons. It's very dependent on America's diplomatic protection, international institutions. Biden is, to the right, one could say, of people like Ronald Reagan. I mean, Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s in Lebanon, eventually basically told the Israelis to stop immediately. And even in terms that you can imagine did not go over very well in Israel, compared what Israel is doing in Lebanon to a Holocaust. He actually used that word in a private conversation with the Israeli prime minister. There actually is a history of American presidents, despite the alliance between America and Israel, of basically telling Israel that we were going to stop arms sales. And Joe Biden, for maybe partly because of the political environment in which he grew up in, maybe he just doesn't have the capacity at this point to really to change course. I think is insanely has had this idea for close to a year now, that basically through private diplomacy and a kind of passive aggressive strategy of sometimes leaking to the American media that he's unhappy with Benjamin Netanyahu, that's going to stop Benjamin Netanyahu from behaving. There's nothing in the political career of Benjamin Netanyahu would suggest that this would have any effect whatsoever. I mean, Netanyahu has been basically, defying American presidents for as long as he's been in political power, and will continue to do so unless basically he faces genuine, real pressure. And so, because Biden's not putting any genuine pressure on him, it's much politically easier for him to basically go with the right-wing people in his government who could bring down his government and basically lead Israel to have to go to new elections and lead him to have to be on trial. And he doesn't want that. And the insanity of it, I mean, for me, the insanity from American perspective is multifold. First of all, the Biden administration, especially after the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its whole foreign policy was basically around the idea that we were entering a new Cold War with Russia and China, and that there was going to be a kind of moral distinction, in the same way that Americans like to imagine the Cold War of the 20th century, that there's going to be a clear moral distinction. And the Biden administration talked in very moralistic terms about it as the defender of the rules-based international order. It even cooperated with the International Criminal Court to try to prosecute Putin and Russian officials. And now that has just been completely demolished, right, around the world, and in significant measure in the United States, which will have long-term impact, I think, on America's ability to convince anyone that an American-led world order has any more legitimacy than, frankly, any other alternative world order, right? Especially in the global South. But beyond that, the continuation of this war and now its expansion in Lebanon is a tremendous gift to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump's kind of core message in this election is, first of all, that the economy is bad. Secondly, that immigration is out of control. And thirdly, that the world is out of control. And on that third point, Benjamin Netanyahu is doing him a great favor by basically turning this into a regional war. It's a serious problem for Kamala Harris, and the fact that the Democratic and Trump actually in a speech a week ago actually asked Israel explicitly to intervene in this election on his behalf. And whether Benjamin Netanyahu is doing this whether this is the reason Netanyahu is doing this does have the effect of helping Trump, who Netanyahu would certainly prefer to be the president. And the extraordinary thing is the Biden administration is letting him do it, is helping him do this, something which is politically disastrous for Democrats, in addition, I think, to being disastrous for the people of Lebanon, and I think that for the people of Israel as well. I mean, we can talk more about it, but I just find it baffling that people think that the long-term security consequences for Israel of this are going to be good.
Why do you think, I guess, like, we see all of those same contradictions here as well? I mean, obviously our government is, we're not as powerful as the US, we're not as complicit, but our government still does have relationships with Israel that have been, for other countries engaging in similar action, were cut off. Like, we've seen Australia, use international means like sanctions in regard to Israel, but still we're just hearing these sort of words of condemnation, sorry, for Russia, but words of condemnation for Israel. Why do you think that is? I mean, we've heard some people here say the government's scared about being called anti-Semitic. They sort of feel like they would be branded as, you know, like there would be there's some sort of faux pas around, you know, taking material action in regard to Israel. But it does, yeah, it does, as you say, it's baffling to us. And I'm interested for your thoughts about why you think that is the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly on the American right and even the American center, there is a very, very strong identification with Israel as a, you know, you could say a country whose history in many ways resembles American history, right? I mean, America is a settler colonial project, and in many ways, I mean, the notion of a country that was forged on a hostile frontier, as you know, in some way kind of fulfilling God's wishes, is very, very native to many, many Americans, more Americans on the right, but still a very large group of Americans. And I think that in many ways, for many in the Republican Party, Israel represents a kind of model of what they would like America to be. You know, you often feel Republican, you know, it's a country with very clear legal hierarchies between members of different ethnic and religious groups, and an immigration policy which maintains a demographic majority. These are very much at the core of what the Republican Party wants America to the kind of America they want to see. In the Democratic Party, I do think, you know, one of the things that I think happens when you're in democratic politics, maybe a little bit less for people, younger people, but certainly people who are kind of middle-aged or older, is you become socialized into a kind of way of behaving in which the normal kind of moral and analysis that you do vis-a-vis other countries, you really don't do vis-a-vis Israel, because the political consequences would be so great. Nobody who's in democratic foreign policy circles, often even privately, wants to get the reputation as the person who's considered hostile to Israel, because that's a very, very good way of ensuring that you don't continue into higher positions in American foreign policy. And generally also for politicians, right? I mean, we've seen that even despite this shift that's taking place in public opinion in the Democratic Party, it is much, much, much safer to be even a Democratic Party, a politician who basically supports Israel no matter what, than a politician who is critical of Israel, right? Because again, given the unregulated amount of money that can enter into American politics, that basically you have just astounding amounts of money basically thrown against you in these congressional races. And I think what happens is that a lot of people, I think just over time, they kind of develop a habit of basically not applying the same kind of human rights oriented analysis that they would in other countries that they do vis-a-vis Israel. And they realize and they recognize that people who don't carve out that exception tend not to flourish in political and policy circles, right? So you don't get to be Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken or other folks like that unless you have done that for a long time, and it becomes kind of habitual for you, you know? And I think that's, in some ways, we need an entire transformation of the political and foreign policy class in the United States in order to kind of overcome that very, very deep-seated tendency that exists.
I think following on from that, I guess one of the key features of American foreign policy is, you know, it's international law is okay, but not if it applies to the US or Israel.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we've had I guess a lot of the discourse in more conservative parts of the Jewish community, and I think probably in Australia and I'm sure in the US as well, is around how the UN is anti-Semitic, the ICC, the ICJ. There's a sort of lawfare that's somehow unfair going on against Israel. And we had at a recent event in Melbourne, the Jewish international law expert quoted a former Israeli Supreme Court justice and said Israel was fighting terrorists with its hands tied behind its back by international law. I guess, yeah, how would you respond to that sort of statement? Has Israel been forced into this war? And is it fighting within the bounds of international law?
I mean, look, if you're going to argue that that Israel has been, following international law, you need to be able to cite some legitimate authorities on international law that actually say that, rather than just Israeli government officials and pro-Israel Jewish institutions, right? I mean, if your argument is strong, presumably some human rights group out there, or some international court, or some serious, significant body of global international human rights scholars would actually take that view, but they simply don't, right? I mean, I think Israel's among people who actually study international law, Israel's arguments in its defense are taken about as seriously as Russia's arguments in its defense. And by the way, 4 days after Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, the Russian defense minister accused the Ukrainians of doing what? Of using their population as human shields, right? This idea that only Israel uses this line about human shields. First of all guerrilla groups basically fight from within local populations, right? No guerrilla group basically puts on a uniform, walks out into a field, and basically says, hey, let's have a fight. This is the way the Viet Cong fought, And by the way, how did the Viet Cong fight the United States? By building a huge labyrinth of tunnels. Why did they build tunnels? Because they also were being bombed from the air by a very formidable air force. A lot of the things that Hamas is doing, and I'm not defending them, morally, they are very problematic, but they're not unusual. This is the way that guerrilla groups fight, and international law has developed a mechanism that says that even if guerrillas are fighting within a population, you still have to safeguard the population. You still have to use proportionality. And more fundamentally, you should think about, whenever you're fighting an insurgency, that this is fundamentally a political problem that you have. You rarely defeat insurgencies only with military mechanisms. You can devastate the country, as the US devastated Vietnam and as Israel's devastating Gaza. But unless you offer the population some alternative, some vision of freedom that you are offering them, military means are never going to succeed alone. So I think that these attacks on these international institutions are very frustrating to me for a number of reasons. First of all, nobody is happier about the work that Israel and these Jewish organizations are doing to tear down and discredit human rights groups and international courts. No one is happier about this than Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, and every other dictator, and we've seen this as the result of, we can see the impact of what America did when it invaded Iraq and the war on terror. When you carve out these exceptions and discredit these institutions, right? The American Jewish institutions are literally supporting legislation in Congress that would sanction not only the prosecutor of the ICC, but his 2 children, right? When you act in this kind of thuggish a way, you are tearing down the very fragile fabric we have of international laws and rules and institutions. And we don't know there are many countries that will take the opportunity to take advantage of that and do terrible, terrible things. The second thing that I find so frustrating about this is, if you accept that Palestinians lack basic freedom, right? That Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, both in different ways, live under the control of an Israeli state that dominates their lives, but does not grant them citizenship, does not grant them the right to vote for the government that is making these life and death decisions over them, right? That Palestinians, you have to accept that Palestinians are going to resist this basic lack of freedom, as all people would. And if you don't want Israeli civilians to die, and you don't want Palestinians to kill Israeli civilians, which is a violation of international law, and which is a violation of human rights, and which I fundamentally oppose. I think the October 7th attacks were horrifying. You have to offer Palestinians some other way of fighting for their rights, right? But what these Jewish institutions do, and Israel does, is you systematically try to shut down and block any Palestinian effort at struggling for freedom, right? So when Palestinians go to the UN, you try to make sure that fails. When they go to the ICC, when they do boycotts, investments, and sanctions, when they do largely unarmed marches like the Great March of Return, right? And it's striking to me when I talk to Palestinian friends, especially from Gaza, who recount their conversations with members of Hamas. A number of them have told me that people in Hamas will say to them, how well did your efforts work out, right? How successful have your nonviolent efforts? How did that international law thing going for you? They even say vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, you pursued a strategy of collaboration. Your strategy was to work with Israel to try to stop armed resistance, to convince the Israelis that then Palestinians could be trusted with a state. Has that worked out for you? That empowers Hamas in Hamas's or Islamic Jihad in their efforts to use violence, including violence against civilians. So I think it's extremely dangerous, actually, for us to destroy these Palestinian efforts that are nonviolent and they're using the language of international law, because you're only going to empower Palestinians who resist in more dangerous and less ethical ways.
One of the biggest objections that we get, I think sometimes we hear people, obviously there are some people that we speak to who don't accept sort of those underlying facts and premise that you mentioned. But there seems to me to also be a lot of people within the Jewish community who, respond to, these calls for Palestinian freedom and justice with this kind of realpolitik or cynical response, something along the lines of, I accept that, obviously the occupation is bad. It's an aberration. Yes, I don't like Netanyahu. Yes, I don't like, the what Israel's currently doing. But, really, this is about if we are to speak out in this moment, then we would be going against all Jewish people. And we, as Jews, even if we disagree with Israel or its government, we put other Jewish people at risk if we vocalize this, because, we are arguing for, and this is something that, some of the people say about the Jewish Council, they say, well, you are making the Jewish community less safe because you're criticizing Israel and enabling these people that hate us, and we need this strong Israeli state. Even if we disagree with it, we can't speak out. And what do you think is needed? And I assume that there is similar sort of conversations happening in the US, and people turning inwards and feeling really scared and terrified about, anti-Semitism and what they perceive to be an attack on their fundamental identity, which involves support for Israel. What do you think is needed for us to bring those people along and to practically shift Jewish opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, the thing that has the biggest impact on people is an actual engagement with Palestinians. Because I think that there's such a deep level of dehumanization where Palestinians are always talked about this kind of dangerous, faceless mass that many people don't think of themselves as racist towards Palestinians. They really don't. They don't think of themselves. But actually, when they actually meet Palestinians, or they read books by Palestinians or watch films, and they see that actually these Palestinians that they're meeting or that they're reading about actually have no greater desire to kill or be killed than they do, and are every bit as sophisticated and thoughtful and funny and human and everything, they're often surprised because in Jewish institutions, people spend their entire lives talking about Palestinians. We're never listening to Palestinians, which is a recipe for dehumanization, I think. So that, I think, is potentially the most transformative. In terms of this idea that people foment anti-Semitism when Jews criticize Israel, first of all, I'm always find it kind of amusing when people say, your criticism of Israel is making Israel look bad. I mean, I've really never met a Palestinian, or frankly anybody, who said, Peter, I thought Israel was really great until I heard you saying these negative things about it. People can see on their own television screens or their social media, they can see what's happening, right? I think, frankly, the impact of Jewish voices in speaking out for Palestinian freedom is one of the most powerful antidotes we have against anti-Semitism. And I think because it sends, one of the things that I find always remarkable is when I watch some of the protests that have happened by Jewish groups in the United States since October 7th, I often look on the social media feeds to see the responses. And to see the responses from the Arab and Muslim world are actually often quite remarkable, right? Because these things then become an affirmation for people that this is not a struggle of one tribe against another tribe. It's a struggle for certain basic principles, right? That anybody can be a part of. I think that's an extremely important message. one of the things that I think was critically important in South Africa was that in the 1960s, in really some of the darkest days of apartheid, there were a critical group of white South Africans, most of them, but not all of them Jewish, who really sacrificed themselves for the anti-apartheid struggle. Many of them were imprisoned. Some of them were tortured. Many of them went into exile. Those people had a big impact on Nelson Mandela and on the other Black ANC leaders. And so in later generations, in the 70s and 80s, when a new generation of Black leaders, of Black consciousness leaders and PAC leaders said, we don't want whites in this struggle, right? This should be a Black country. This experience of solidarity with white South Africans helped the ANC to hold the line about this being a multiracial vision of a country, right? And I think that it's the movement that is emerging now. It's critically important that Jews are part of this movement, that Jews and people from all different backgrounds are part of this movement, and that it reinforces for Palestinians, for Muslims, for Arabs, for everybody, right? That this is not a struggle of Jews against Palestinians or Jews against Muslims. It's basically it's one part of a global struggle about the principle of equality under the law versus the principle of essentially tribal supremacy. That do we want a world where every country basically has one dominant tribe and everybody else are either second-class citizens or non-citizens at all, or do we want a country in which we have a vision of equal citizenship? And I think I think Jews in this movement can play a really important role in emphasizing that.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. Next question, I guess, is one that we asked for questions for people to submit before this forum. And a lot of them really are about, I guess, people dealing with some of the fallout from their families, friends, from taking positions that are more critical of Israel. And that's certainly something that we have experienced a lot of as the Jewish Council over the last year. We actually get a lot of abuse from other Jews. There's a lot of policing of Jewish identity, and there's also a lot of, frankly, anti-Semitism that comes from other Jews. So people call us and other progressive Jews self-hating, capos, talk about, the Holocaust a lot. I mean, yeah, I guess, do you have advice? And also, I guess, how should we think about this more broadly in terms of a rise in abuse, threats of violence, and anti-Semitism from other Jews who have very strong Zionist pro-Israel views?
Yeah, I think also in the United States, this is something that everybody deals with a lot, although it's probably even worse in Australia. I mean, I would say, first of all, one of the things that I do notice, maybe not quite as much in Australia, but that I do notice that some of the people who are extremely hostile to my perspective, and I notice that their children are not always so hostile, and even inside those same families. And I sometimes want to say, or I don't say, but I often think, gosh, if your arguments were so compelling, presumably they would be able to be convincing even inside your own family, but evidently they're not. So perhaps they're not so compelling. So I think that's one thing that really gives me hope. I think the second thing is that I think the way I think about it is, if someone says to me, you're a self-hating Jew, you don't care about being Jewish means nothing to you, whatever, it doesn't really matter to ultimately what they think. What matters is what I do, is how I live, right? So to me, it's almost like, there is this tradition in Judaism, that when someone dies or something terrible happens, you take on a certain mitzvah, in memory of someone or in response to something. And so I think about, okay, what am I going to do to show in my own life, if only to me, that actually that I am living a life that's filled with Jewish commitment, and that may express itself in different ways for different people, right? But it seems to me, I do think about what is the way in your own life that you can deepen your commitment to Yiddishkeit and Judaism in whatever way is most compelling for you. I mean, for me, just personally, I'm 4 years or 4.5 years now into doing Daf Yomi, which is a study of a page of Talmud every day, and I can't say it's always scintillating. And it's not, the reason I'm doing it is not as a, not my primary reason, not as a fuck you to people who think I'm a self-hating Jew, but it is a way, one of the but it does a way for me of reminding myself every day that Judaism is much, much older and much, much bigger than the kind of hyper-nationalist politics, in Australia or America in 2024. We are the heirs of a very, very deep, very profound, multivocal tradition, right, in which this is just a blip in time and space. And so there's so many ways of connecting to that. And I think one of the things that is just starting to happen here, and I hope is happening in Australia too, is the creation of institutions that allow people that don't have a kind of don't make Jewish supremacy their litmus test for entrance into the door. They give people the opportunity to actually to learn and to live lives of greater Jewish commitment. And I'm seeing in the United States that they're all, there are minyanim that are being created. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next, in the few years, we might even start to see Jewish schools, Jewish camps, that an set of institutions will emerge that wasn't there when I was growing up. And I think that's something that's really, really worth investing time and energy into, because people need these supports, right? And I also think we have to be able to offer younger people a vision of a robust, joyous, learned, meaningful Jewish existence that doesn't run through support for the destruction of another people.
It's so beautiful to hear about those institutions being created in Australia, in the US. I think we've got a bit of work to do here to really create those alternative institutions. I know that we get, like, our organization receives a lot of emails from people who say, I feel really isolated, I feel really alone, I'm disconnected from my family. And, it's also evident from the fact we've got, I think, over 800 people who've signed on to our core statement of values, but 200 of those people chose to be anonymous. And we know that other Jewish groups have promoted saying, look up to see if your friends and family are on this list, and then shame them. And we had a few people emailing us, really, and it's so tragic to say, I've been contacted by people, it's making my life difficult with my family, I want to be anonymous now, despite the fact that I really agree. And so I think we really need to all think about creating those institutions that makes it safe for people to be Jewish and to have diverse politics. One of the things that I always think about is, like, even if we don't manage to convince the whole Jewish community of the views that we have, we should at least be pushing for a community that doesn't ostracize and alienate each other for having, for supporting different political objectives. I mean, we should also hopefully try to be convincing people of Palestinian freedom and humanity. But it's a first step to sort of make it a bit more public. And that, I think, kind of leads a little bit to our final question, because I know we're at 5 to 11 or 5 to 9 p.m. your time. What do you think that this moment demands of us as Jewish people? And I know you've spoken a lot in your writing and work about, our particular Jewish values that should mean that we are supportive of Palestinian freedom and human rights and liberty, and the right of return, in a way that our Jewishness should be highlighted. And I guess my question is, what does it demand of us as Jewish people, and why do you think, or do you think that it demands of us something specifically as Jewish people rather than just as human beings?
Right. So look, I mean, I think that if it is totally legitimate to simply approach this as a universal question of human freedom and human dignity, human rights, and certainly one does not need to be Jewish to be engaged in this. In fact, I think it's really this movement can only succeed if people of conscience from all kinds of different backgrounds become engaged in it. But I do think that for Jews, this is being done in our name. That's kind of an inescapable fact. I mean, certainly for Americans, it's also being done with our tax dollars, but for all Jews, it's being done in the name of a certain idea of what it means to be Jewish, and of a state that speaks in the name of the Jewish people very explicitly. And so I think that I think this a notion of being Jewish as being tied to this kind of ethno-nationalist project, this project of Jewish supremacy is extremely dangerous. I think it's extremely dangerous in a whole series of ways. I think it's dangerous for diaspora Jews because this notion of tribal supremacy that Israel has become a kind of model of that kind of country, and the movements that want that in whether they're in Europe or in the United States or in other places that are trying to model themselves after are very dangerous, I think, for diaspora Jews, given that we have generally correctly seen our safety and our flourishing as bound up with the idea of secular states that prize equality under the law, and rather than kind of being guests in white Christian nations. So I think, first of all, I think there's a real self-interest there, even if mainstream Jewish organizations don't really recognize it. And secondly, I do think that that for if it turns out that that the Jewish tradition, there in Judah Levi's book, the Kuzari, there's this, which is structured as this kind of conversation with this pagan king. The Jewish interlocutor, the rabbi, says, we are not like the Christians. We are not like Edom, red, like a tradition tainted in blood, right? And the kings, the pagan king says, well, maybe you just haven't had the opportunity yet. And it seems to me that if the Judaism obviously has many voices, it doesn't speak in one voice, but there is a really extraordinary Jewish ethical tradition that has inspired many people around the world. And if it turns out that Jewish ethical tradition ultimately is meaningless when Jews have in the face of this Jewish nationalist project, and the kind of dominant political expression of Jewishness in the world is basically an ethno-nationalist project that is just as vicious and cruel and brutal as ethno-nationalist projects in many other places. I think that becomes a kind of will be for many people, including, and I see this for young American Jews, a kind of referendum on Jewishness itself. There's this line that Torah is a commentary on the world and the world is a commentary on Torah, right? So what happens in the world and what Jews do in the world is then a commentary on our own tradition, right? And I worry very much about the way in which this will be seen as meaning that our tradition itself, that its moral voice, that its ethical traditions ultimately turned out to be flimsy or irrelevant, right? And so I think that's also part of the reason, I think, in addition, of course, to the central question of the fact that we have moral obligations to Palestinians. I think that the question of what it means to be Jewish in this moment is really on the line. And I think that we will be living with the wreckage of that unless we can change the course of events in Israel-Palestine in ways that will have very tragic and terrible consequences for Jews for a long time to come.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's a very big note to end on, and I guess we'll just point people towards your new book that I believe is coming out early next year, which is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, which delves deeper into these questions. And we put a bunch of links in the chat, including a reminder to subscribe to Peter's Substack newsletter, and I think some links to some of our materials and to our website as well. We will be sending out an email to attendees after this meeting with just a bit of an ask to give us a bit of feedback about the event. Do apologize to everyone who put in questions and that we didn't quite get the chance to get to today. But yeah, just know that this is the first of, we might not have Peter with us again for a little while, but we will be doing some other Jewish Council conversations, including one we've got coming up with Dr. Gabor Mate early next year, and some other things that we've got in the works as well. And in the meantime, we'd love it if you would go onto our website, If you haven't yet, sign on to our statement of core values and sign up to our mailing list. And yeah, we really want to do more in terms of community engagement. Please feel free to send us an email. Also wanted to make mention that today is a National Day of Action for Gaza. So we encourage everyone to get along to one of the rallies. I believe they're happening in all capital cities in Australia, as well as some regional centres as well. Starting at, I think, 12 o'clock, at least the one in Melbourne is. And also, yeah, that you can donate to Power of the Palestine Australia Relief and Action organisation through the link that's just been posted there if you haven't donated already. But yeah, just want to thank everyone for coming along. This has been a really great event, and especially thank Peter for his time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.